My worst. Hi there. I've still got a few people coming in, which is great. Okay, I think I will. I think I'll start. There's somebody who isn't muted. I'll just try and mute them. If you could just make, yeah, brilliant, thank you. People have just muted themselves, which is fantastic. So great, I will start. And if I do stop and start at the beginning, it's because I'm just admitting people, so bear with me. And just to say again, just to reiterate, all these slides will be shared on LinkedIn and sent you via email if you fill out the form that's in the chat. So complex systems, I guess of all the presentations that I'm doing, this is the one that I feel least confident doing, I guess, and feel least qualified to be presenting on. I've only been studying complex systems for the last year or so, and I think there are obviously much better qualified people out there who can talk about this. However, saying that, there hasn't been, I don't think, a lot of work done on complex systems and organisational change, and there's been some very sort of theoretical, conceptual work done, but I haven't seen work that ties complex systems into both the neuroscience and also the various constructs, reliable constructs that we know we have in organisational development, for example. So hopefully this will be a sort of a new area that we can explore together. And I'm sure there are people maybe on this call who have more expertise, or maybe have more expertise in particular areas of complex systems. So just to say that this is a series of talks that I do. Sorry, I'm just letting people in. This is one of a series of 6 talks that I'm doing, and I've already done one on the future of organisational change, whether it's evidence-based, and then the history, and then adopting a scientific mindset, which I did last month. And then you've got the myth-busting organisational change to look forward to, which I'm doing with Paul Gibbons, because we have kind of very similar direction, but sometimes different views on specific things. So that should be entertaining, where we're going to debate some of the myths in organisational change. And I've started posting on the neuroscience of organisational change, which you'll see from my LinkedIn, and I'll be presenting on that in July. And then I'm just sort of wrapping all of this up with how we can build a better knowledge base of organisational change, and I have some ideas of that I'll take you through in that session as well. So if you find these sessions interesting, please sign up to those sessions as well. So today's session, I will be covering why we're using complex systems. So what have complex systems got to do with organisational change at all, or organisational development? What's the history? And I'll hopefully go into actually organisational change and organisational development was probably one of the first disciplines to pick up, or maybe one of the first social sciences to pick up on complex systems, and what the underlying mechanics of complex systems are. And this is what I find so exciting about complex systems, is that there are some fundamental mechanics that apply to all living things. And I think that's wonderful to be able to make that connection across lots of different disciplines, and that then allows us to bring in lots of different disciplines into our thinking within organisational change. You know, if organisations are complex systems, then what do they have in common with biological systems or chemical systems? Or okay, and then we'll go another layer up, which is, okay, so if those mechanics of complex systems, if we accept those, then what kind of characteristics do they give us within complex systems? And we'll talk about the conditions. There are 4 conditions of complex systems which lead to certain outcomes that we see within complex systems. And then all the way through this, I'm relating this to various concepts in organisational change. And then I'll just summarise on why I think there are benefits in looking at complex systems in organisational change and some of the issues that it potentially addresses within organisational change. And one of those issues, I guess, within organisational change, my personal view, is that I don't think we have a clear way of judging whether knowledge that we have is valid and reliable. We haven't really adopted a scientific mindset. Much of what is within organisational changes is based on quite a lot of sort of pop psychology and myths that I'll be covering next month. And that's why I'm a keen advocate of an evidence-based process, because at least that gives us some grounding on how we judge our knowledge and whether it's, you know, worthy of including in our body of knowledge. And then there are questions around how we organise and what methodologies we use and what methods we use to make sure that we are continually building a more valid and reliable body of knowledge. And I think complex systems help us with this. So, for example, in terms of the ontology, so whether we judge whether something is really relevant to organisational change, if we're saying organisations are complex systems, then if we're using, say, for example, linear models of organisational change, and we know that complex systems are non-linear, then that kind of sends a bit of alarm bell. Why are we using, you know, stage approaches to change when we know that they are actually iterative and circular? And, you know, similarly, how we organise our knowledge. So we know that complex systems at a very fundamental level need energy. So a good place to start with organisational change, it would make sense, would be, well, if organisational systems need energy to adapt, then maybe we should run change readiness assessments before we do any change and try and understand energy levels. And energy levels are equated to levels of employee engagement, for example. So there's a nice synergy there, and we'll deep dive into that a bit more. And then as we go through change, how are we sustaining energy levels? So if we are working in a non-equilibrium state, as we are with change, then that requires continual sort of resupply of energy, as it were, which we know happens in complex systems. And so maybe we should be using that in organisational change as well. So it just gives us nice lenses in which we can judge and calibrate whether our current knowledge base is likely to work or not. So I think it gives us a good foundation and a good ontology and epistemology in which we can sort of fit our organisational change knowledge. And I've referred to this study in my other talks as well, which is just saying what is really wrong with organisational change at the moment. So if we want to improve our understanding of organisational change, what are the areas that we need to improve on? This is from Pettigrew in 2001, and they list these 5 things. And you can see there at the top of the list is getting a better understanding of the context of organisational change and the complexity of organisational change. So how do organisations adapt to changing external conditions? How do we adapt internal conditions to match external conditions? And what patterns from previous change interventions or change programs, what impact do they have on current change programs? If you've got, you know, lots of failure in the past, then it's obviously going to impact people's feeling of efficacy for a new change. And that's an area we don't really understand, or maybe we don't take into consideration when we're looking at organisational change. And that's really critical for complex systems, because complex systems have memory, and we know organisations have memory as well. And there's this relationship between change and performance. You know, how do we actually manage the impact that our change is having on the performance of an organisation? And pacing and readiness as well. So we mentioned sort of energy levels. How do we pace the system? We know that, again, complex systems need to have energy levels sustained in order to stay out of equilibrium and to maintain their change capability. Sorry, there's a hand up from Diane there. Did you want to just chip in?
Yeah, one quick question. I kind of view the COVID thing as there's pre-COVID and there's current and post-COVID. You mentioned that this study is of 2001, and I'm curious if there's been any research or if you know of any additional research that's been going on to see how much of that is still applicable, or is it kind of starting all over again, or is it just a bump in the road and we're continuing as is? Just kind of curious if anybody else had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, the fact that these observations are 20 years out of date, I guess, but still seem to be relevant. At least for me, it would be good to get other people's view on whether they think this is relevant. I mean, certainly the last point here is still relevant, that we still haven't managed to bridge the scholar practitioner.
If anything, we've made it more complex.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a good point, isn't it? Is that I guess COVID is as probably one of the most uncertain states that maybe we will ever experience. I mean, people always talk about, and we'll talk about this later, about levels of uncertainty increasing through time. And as systems become more complex and there's more information floating around, so levels of uncertainty are probably likely to go up as well. So that's an interesting point, isn't it? People are always talking about trying to simplify, but I think you can only simplify if you understand the underlying structures. And this is the sort of reduction holistic debate as well, that, you know, you need to be able to break things down to understand how they're working at a large scale. But yeah, good point, Diane. So let's keep that. If people can keep those thoughts, you can add questions to the chat. And I'll have breaks at the end of these sessions anyway, where we can talk about these things. Okay, great. So so what's the other reason for thinking about complex systems? Well, I think that they allow us to think in a more systems way about the issues that we face within organisational change. And I think there's a natural relationship between that and being adopting a scientific mindset and adopting an evidence-based approach. So maybe your experience as practitioners, is certainly my experience, is that people see a bunch of events and they go out and they sort of think that the problem is they don't have a solution rather than trying to understand what the problem is. So we're just sort of knee-jerking and what's called sort of solutioneering to events as they happen. And we know that, you know, if we want to understand a system, then we've got to go levels below that to understand what are the patterns in the system that are creating those events. So we have to go a level lower. And so I don't know if you can just manage to pull my headphones out. And those patterns are determined obviously by the structures. So, you know, what are the relational structures that create the patterns of behavior? And those structures are created by the mental models that people hold in their head about the way things should be done within an organization. And those mental models are based on their values as well. So if we want to change in a sort of more sustainable way, then we really need to be deeper diving into these sort of level 2, 3, and 4. And I think understanding complex systems allows us to do that, and so that we can truly get to transformative change rather than just this sort of reactive change or even anticipative change. And I guess the last point as well, being trying to keep everybody happy, is that when I ran this poll, sorry, I can just, someone's coming. If they could just turn their speaker off, or sorry, their microphone off. Yeah, that actually, you know, 60% of people, 80% if you take in the maybes as well, said that they thought that complex systems were useful in understanding organisational change. Okay, so any sort of questions on that first bit before I get into the history of organisational change? Does that all make sense? Have I offered a sort of half decent rationale for why we need to consider complex systems in organisational change? or any other points you'd like to add to that. I'll keep moving on. I mean, if people want to, yep, thanks for the thumbs up. If people want to put stuff into chat, if questions are not coming to you now, please put them in. And what I find really fascinating about this is I've talked to people who have worked on complexity theory for a long time, and in fact they talk about complexity theory and organizational change sort of happening around sort of 80s or well 90s, and in fact if you go back into the sort of original text, as it were, around organizational development and organizational change, then you can see that people are talking about complex systems as far back as 1960, and I'll come on to that example. But here you've got Emery and Trist talking about what I think is they're talking about complex systems, and we'll talk about that in more detail on the next slide. And then you've got Katz and Kahn here as well, 66, talking about the difference between open and closed systems, that we should stop thinking of human organizations as closed systems, i.e. not reacting to external environments, and been treating them as open systems, which means that they are reacting to or constantly out of equilibrium and constantly trying to understand their external environment. So they're acting like living systems, and that's Katz and Kahn. And then French and Bell as well, talking about interdependencies between structures and human social interaction and goals and tasks, and really understanding, as we said in the iceberg, that there are underlying systems that create patterns of behavior that then create these sort of events. So I think, maybe it's not explicit and they're not using the same language, but I think these people were thinking in those terms during the 60s. And here is, I'm sorry for the busy slide, but I always think it's worth going back to the original text in these things, and it is worth getting these books. You can get them on secondhand bookstores for £5 or whatever, and you can get all of Lewin's work online, which is fantastic. But it's interesting, isn't it? People talk about the rate of change now, and this is a book. This is written in 1963, published in 1964. By Emery and Trist, and they say the main problem in studying organisational change is the environment context in which organisations exist are themselves changing. So there's this constant dynamic and feedback between the environment and the organisation, which increases complexity. And then they say that this is happening at an increasingly complex rate, and that's exactly what we've just been talking about, isn't it, Diane? COVID, everybody's talking about everything is becoming more and more complex, and here we are 60 years ago with people saying, well, even then people thought that things are becoming increasingly complex. So I just highlighted some of these points that they're saying here, but this idea of open and closed systems came apparent, or was thought about in biology in living systems in 1950 by Bertolaffi, so I get his name right, who wrote a very famous sort of article about the difference between open and closed systems. And then I think everybody kind of jumped on that bandwagon, and then people are sort of interpreting what he wrote into organisational change as well. And this top bit of text here is actually from Lewin in 1943, where he talks about the whole is not more than the sum of the parts, but it's just different. So when people talk about complexity, they talk about this idea of emergence, and that the whole of an organisation is more than the sum of the individuals. And Lewin is sort of saying, okay, well, that's sort of Gestalt way of thinking about it. But what he's saying is it's not more, it's different. But again, that is the language that is a complexity language. He's thinking about organizations in a complex way, which is actually written before 1950, because of course Lewin had died by then. So I think there's a really strong history of using complex systems, or thinking in complex thinking in terms of complex systems, in terms of organizational development and change. And you can't see this very well on this slide, but here is a Wikipedia. And as I said, the people who put this map together are saying that the history of complexity science really starts, and you can't see this, it says organisational development and complexity. See if I can zoom in actually on that. Sorry. How do I zoom in? Can I zoom? How do I zoom? Anyway, I'm sure I can. But they're saying actually that this thinking started in the 80s and 90s, and actually I'd sort of contest that and suggest that goes all the way back to the 60s. But worth going on to Wikipedia, complex systems, and having a look at that diagram a bit more zoomed in than I can show you here. So I think a lovely way to think about complex systems is, and I'm sorry that's fallen off the side of the slide there, is think about Starling murmuration. So for me, this works on so many different levels that you know, starlings can form huge masses. So you imagine this is an organization, and they sort of seem to magically be able to coordinate their behavior within something that looks actually extremely complex and a bit and very sort of messy, but sort of beautiful and magical. And when they've modeled these, and you can go online, you can go onto YouTube, you can watch simulations of starlings, and it looks exactly like an actual murmuration itself. And it's actually quite easy to simulate a murmuration because it's basically just three variables, which is cohesion, that starlings want to stay close to each other, so they shouldn't be drifting too far apart, but they should also be able to move far enough apart so they don't bump into each other. So there's that tension between autonomy of the individual and complying to the structure, which is something that's sort of being part of organisational development and organisational change right from the start, right from the 60s. People have talked about how do we get this balance between autonomy and structure, giving people individual freedom, making them feel self-efficacious, self-confident, but at the same time offering a structure, you know, certain processes that they need to follow, etc. And then, of course, there's alignment. So what direction are we going in? So we try and stay in line with each other as we move as well. And if you think about organisational change, that's a very fundamental level. That's kind of what we're trying to do, isn't it? We're trying to give people a sense of autonomy in the change, but we're trying to get them to go in a certain way because that delivers business needs. And we've got to have some kind of planned structure around how we're going to change. So yeah, I think a starling murmuration is a lovely way to present how complex systems can apply to organisational theory, organisational change and organisational development. And then I just think there's this question around complex systems because, you know, although complex systems, you know, are talked about a lot, they could potentially just be another dodgy concept because that we can't falsify them. There's no clear definition. They're you know, they're unprovable, and they're sort of too complex to measure. So they just seem to be in a bit of an ether, and that kind of makes a perfect ingredient for a dodgy concept. You know, there's lots of ideas out there that we can never prove, and we'll go into why that is because, well, I'll talk about it later, but complex systems, as you saw from the previous from this diagram, is really just a set of frameworks that are adapted for different environments. So I guess that's part of what this talk is as well, is what elements of complexity theory, and it is huge, can we use for organisational or relevant to organisational change. And I think there's just quickly some misconceptions. You might agree or disagree with some of these things, but you hear people saying organisational complex systems are chaotic. They're not chaotic. They're sort of deterministically chaotic in the sense that they're, you know, they're on a scale of being sort of ordered to disordered, but they're never strictly chaotic. They're not unpredictable. They're probabilistic. In fact, they can be highly predictable because there's lots of feedback loops. And as I said, three simple rules you can use to predict a murmuration. They're not trying to necessarily get back to equilibrium, which is this view of homeostasis. We're not trying to necessarily get to an equilibrium. What is fascinating about complex systems, they can stay out of equilibrium for quite a long time. And so I think we need to talk more about Eleostatic load, which is how much stress can the system take whilst it is out of equilibrium. And this is a really important idea for organisational change, that as soon as you start change, you're starting to put people under stress and pressure because they're experiencing new things, or maybe they're having to work differently or harder or whatever. And this is, you know, how much stress are you putting on individuals, and potentially how energy draining is the change, and are you measuring that, and are you balancing that? It's not necessarily these characteristics of complex systems are not necessarily just applicable to living systems. Your router, which is you know, giving you enough bandwidth from your child using Wi-Fi or whatever in another room, is adaptive. It's an adaptive system. It can allocate bandwidth accordingly, but it's not a living system. So it's easier to think about the characteristics of complex systems as being functional rather than being distinguished by whether it's a living or inanimate sort of object, because there are inanimate things that potentially could be complex as well. And it's not, as I mentioned with Lewin, and I think this is a good distinction. We're not necessarily complex systems that aren't necessarily more than the parts. An organisation isn't necessarily more than just the individual. It's different. And it's different because there are certain emergent behaviours that you wouldn't see at an individual level. So that's just very quick on some of the misconceptions that I've seen. I think are misconceptions anyway, and because complex systems, you know, you can debate this stuff. So I thought it would just be worth going into some of the mechanics of complex systems, and this again is my view. I don't think this has been sort of written down anywhere, but this is trying to use the sort of underlying physics and mechanics of what drives the characteristics that we see in complex systems. And the first one, which is I think fairly obvious one and quite simple potentially to understand, although these things just go in layers, and you can go into layers and layers and layers, is thinking about entropy. You know, things naturally decay. Organisations naturally decay. If they're not reinventing themselves, then eventually they will lose market share or whatever. And we decay as well, don't we? If we're not learning, if we're not gathering information and learning new things, we potentially, I guess, could be out of a job. So entropy I think is a good starting point, that things naturally sort of reduce over time. And this also impacts on organizational structure as well. So we can have a fully disorganized structure which has very high levels of entropy. So it's you know, there's high levels of randomness. So it needs a lot of energy to keep it going. So when you think about, I don't know, agile organizations or trying to create more dynamic organizations, that they need more energy to keep them going. Because they have low structure, but you've got high levels of autonomy. You know, people are very free to do what they want because there isn't structure, and there's high levels of energy that need to be available. And at the other extreme, you've got highly structured organisations, and this makes you sort of realise why we do structure organisations, and complex systems aren't kind of naturally hierarchical anyway. That it actually reduces the amount of energy that it needs to survive. The more structured it is, the more, you know, we can control things. But obviously control is a bit of an illusion in complex systems because people want to have their own autonomy, and it could stifle innovation. So again, it's how do we get this balance between lots of energy but kind of quite disorganized, and sort of fully structured with kind of low levels of energy. So that's entropy, and obviously there's a lot more you can dive into here. The other idea is free energy. So this comes down to people's view of neuroscience and how the brain goes out and actively seeks information that supports its world, which is why it's difficult to change people's attitude and change their beliefs, because we are actively seeking information that tells us that we are who we are, which is understandable. So we make predictions, we get observations, and then the difference between those predictions and observations is what is called free energy. So it's a prediction error. And obviously, if we get a prediction error, that requires energy. We need to go out and try and make that prediction more accurate. And we can do that by changing our minds. Okay, right, so I was wrong. My belief is wrong. So that isn't an apple, that's a pear. So I can do that. Or I can go out and change the world. I can go out and try and convince the world that actually this is an apple and not a pear. And yeah, we actually ran an interesting poll on this. Is it easier to change your mind, or is it easier to change the world? And we got some interesting responses from that as well. But I guess what we're trying to do in organisational change is we're trying to change people. We're trying to change a world, aren't we, that we want people to align to, and we want people to make predictions that are aligned to that new world that we're trying to create. So I think this is an interesting idea as well for organisational change, and we'll talk about Markov blankets, which I've mentioned here as well in the next couple of slides. And then we get into questions around, so how do we update our beliefs? How do we change people's mind, and how do we change their view of the world in order to change their ways of working? And there is this idea of Bayesian updating, which is simply saying that people have a bunch of current beliefs and they are presented with new information. So the organisation presents them, I don't know, a communication or a message from the CEO or something, and they have to reconcile their current beliefs, or what are called prior beliefs, with these potentially new beliefs. And they do that by assessing a likelihood of that new belief being correct or not. And I guess, in organisational change, the more people you've got saying, yes, this change is going to happen, the more likely I am to believe. If I hear my peers saying it, and if I hear my boss saying it, and if I hear everybody saying it, and they're all kind of saying the same thing, you think, oh, okay, right, this is really going to happen. So I need to sort of change my beliefs about the kind of organisation that I work in. But we're doing this, every millisecond or whatever the smallest, we're doing this all the time. This is what our brains are constantly doing. When I put my hand down now to click over these slides, my hand is assuming I'm going to touch a mouse, and I know what that mouse is going to be like. And if I touch my cat, it would create sort of surprise, and we're trying to minimise surprise. So that's basically, and we'll come on to this in more detail in my post on neuroscience. And I just think this is a lovely demonstration of how Bayesian updating works. That you can imagine two people having two different views, or the blue line is an organisation trying to convince the green line, which is an individual, that they need to follow this change. And you can see over time there's this sort of gradual alignment as the algorithm sort of updates itself with new information, and we're trying to get these sort of two different areas, two different views aligned. And of course, this is the beauty of using complexity science as well, is that all of these ideas are underpinned by the maths and the mechanics. So the Markov blankets is also a sort of a formula within maths as well, which is how you distinguish two sort of separate systems. And I like to think of this as sort of like comfort blankets, that we create comfort blankets around ourselves, predictable environments. Our home is a predictable environment. We know where everything is. People come in and out of our house who we know. When we get into environments we're not familiar with, we feel less comfortable. And this is what the Markov blanket is sort of saying, is that from bacteria to animals roaming around in the wild or whatever, they inhabit systems that they know they can survive in. And so when we are again trying to put people through change, we're pushing their Markov blanket out, and we're sort of challenging their sort of comfort zones. And this is and people can update that view through Bayesian updating, through this sort of acting and sensing process as well, to try and minimize free energy. So when they act, if you say to them, well, if you act in this way, it's more aligned to where the organization wants to go. If they act in that way and then sort of says, oh no, you shouldn't do that, that's going to create a lot of surprise, because they've been told to do something and now they're being told to do something else. So this whole idea of congruence and being very clear on the behaviors you expect of people is so critical for organizational change. I will break now because there's quite a few, there's some comments Are there methods of inquiry you recommend that address the levels? Jen, is that relating to the
iceberg-looking slide?
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, it was a little while ago.
A while ago. Okay, yeah, we don't need to go back, but yeah. Different methods of inquiry. I think there might be, because if you've ever heard of the trans-theoretical model of behavioural change, there are different sets of interventions for different levels of change that people are. And I wonder whether at the value stage, you might start with just sort of a listening, questioning kind of reflection, and then I don't know. I'd have to think about it. It's a good question. Yeah. Is that Evelina? Lena?
It's Evelina.
Sorry?
It's Evelina.
Evelina, sorry, thank you.
Yes.
What did you mean, your question? Are they dispositional?
So there is not really a clear, I mean, to me, like, the definition of complexity is that there's not a clear causal relationship. So when you were talking about the systems thinking, which is characterized by causal relationship, how is that different from complexity thinking that is more dispositional, more about the characteristics of the ingredients rather than what's causing what?
So, sorry, so you're saying that complex systems are
Dispositional.
Are not causal?
They're, yes. I'm stalking Dave Snowden, and he talks very frequently about how systems thinking is a different thinking from complexity thinking, and stresses the difference between systems thinking, which is characterized by causal relationships, and complexity thinking, in which causal relationships are known only in retrospective.
Yeah, I maybe. I mean, Dave Snowden will probably know a lot more about this than I would, but arguably,
I mean,
any
it's really
relationship.
fascinating.
Yeah,
it's really fascinating because if A causes B in a non-complex system, then A might cause B in another system. But in a complex system, if A causes B, then we still don't know if another A is going to cause another B, because the system is much less predictable than a non-complex system.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this is where a sort of an experimental approach to organisational change comes in, doesn't it? I mean, I always sort of characterise it as sort of touching the blob in a way. You don't know how the system's going to react until you start intervening with it. And I guess the interventions that you make now arguably might not be relevant in the future at some point. I think as long as we're aware of that. But I think you can. I think you can make causal claims, but they're always likelihood based, aren't they? You're never saying A will definitely cause B, but you'll say, look, I think the likelihood is what we've seen in other organisations, what the research tells us, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think Sebastian just wrote something about it. It's basically quoting Kinevin, that it's more of a complicated and complex system. The causal relationships are more characteristic to ordered systems, not disordered systems.
Yeah, maybe. And complex systems can be ordered and disordered, which I guess that would be a good way to start a change program, would it? To try and understand how ordered it was, and to try and understand how causal you think the potential relationships are.
Yeah. I don't know, but you're going to make me think really hard. I'm going to be thinking about it tonight. So, I mean, this is very thought-provoking. So, thank you. No,
it's good, and I'll end with a way in which we can, potentially get more confident in our causal claims, potentially treating systems as complex. Okay, good. Sebastian, did you want to chip in on that? I know you've written something about that. And if people do have any links to what other people have written about this, please put them in, because I'm by no means have a definitive knowledge on this, and it would be great if yeah, good, okay, thanks for that. So let's move on then. So we talked about the basic underlying mechanisms and mechanics, I guess, which I find exciting, as I mentioned at the beginning, because they're common across all living systems. You know, the idea of entropy and free energy and Bayesian updating, Markov blankets, etc. So how does that give us the characteristics of complex systems? And so, you know, we know it's not easy to define complex systems, and but we can break them down into common characteristics, and we do that by just sort of saying, well, there are some conditions which create certain outcomes within complex systems. So the first one, well, I'll go through this, but I think if you want to read something that's sort of fairly up to date on complexity theory and what is a complex system, is this book that I've quoted here by Ladyman and Wisner, which was published in the end of 2020, What is a Complex System? And it's very readable. Well, the beginning is, and then it gets into a bit of maths at the end, but you can skip the maths bit if you're not comfortable with that. But certainly, that, you know, 80% of the book is very readable and very intriguing, and lots of interesting examples, although nothing specifically to organisational change, but it'll get your mind going as it did mine, I'm sure. So let's just quickly whiz through these, and I am conscious of time. So the first one is they talk about numerosity. So you've got to have lots of things, players, actors within the system for it to be complex, and that seems to be sort of self-explanatory. And I would go sort of another level and say, well, the system's got to have energy, because the numbers that you have create interactions which create energy. So maybe we're talking about energy levels here, and this creates you know, collective intelligence, which is one of the sort of emergent phenomena of getting, you know, lots of people together, and it does create, Ladyman and Wisner claim, a causality, because there are all these potential feedback loops, and because there are interactions as well. It creates sense making and meaning as well within the system. It also means that it's controllable. So if you understand how the feedback loops work, and you understand sort of how much energy is within the system, it kind of makes it to a degree controllable. And I thought this was an interesting starting point for understanding change readiness. So how running change in an organization of 20 people is going to be a completely different experience from running change in 20,000 people. And why is that? Why would that happen? So, you know, is it easier to align 20 people than it is 20,000 people? There's more energy in a 20,000 people system than so that's a positive. I don't know. I think it just frames the way maybe we think about change. And I could, you know, energy is conceived as being engagement. So when Carl originally talks about employee engagement, he talks about return on my investment of my energy within the organization. So I'm going to put in a certain amount of energy, and if that energy is being wasted by the organization, then I will withdraw it. And that's what he conceives engagement to be. And this is a CIPD evidence review of employee engagement, which consists of these three factors, but I'll sort of skim over that. Then the second one is this balance between diversity and disorder. So as we get bigger as an organization, we get different types of people, and those different types of people create different boundaries that they use energy, because we have to understand other people. We create boundaries because everything's not the same. If everything was the same, there would be nothing. So difference creates individuals, and that's the whole idea of a Markov blanket as well, is that I can segregate myself from somebody else, from the organisation, from a group. And you know, these disordered systems tend to become ordered around certain goals, and you see spontaneous order emerging, but there's no central control, and the behavior tends to be sort of adaptive, and we'll talk about that later. But I also think this is an interesting concept in terms of inclusive cultures and diversity and inclusion, and also this dichotomy between, or this paradox between, the drive of people to want to stand out and demonstrate their individual uniqueness, and wanting a sense of belonging within an organisation as well. So we crave diversity, we crave difference, but also we want to be the same. And getting that balance right creates an inclusive culture, or an inclusive process for running organisational change as well, recognising that people have their individual contributions, but at the end of the day, I was going to say they have to toe the line, but that sounds a bit crude. At the end of the day, we want them to create value for the business, don't we? Otherwise, yeah, there's not much point to the change. And then there's, you know, these different different components start to, you know, are interacting. There are these feedback loops, and feedback loops, as I mentioned, create the sort of the causality and create stability within the system as well. So we can see actually the feedback loops, like you see the Starling murmuration, allow us to sort of have an idea of where the system is going to go, because people are having similar conversations, people have similar characteristics, you know, talking about things in similar ways, and so people start to sort of maybe standardize their behaviors, and this creates resilience of the system. We know how the system's going to respond. We know if a falcon swoops in on Starling murmuration, we can be pretty certain how, you know, maybe, or we can sort of model likelihoods of where that system's going to move. And feedback loops are there in behavioral change models like theory of paired behavior. It's there in Bayesian updating, you know, loops of changing our beliefs. And we'll talk about this in more detail later, but it creates memory as well, because people sort of, I guess, infect other people with their interpretation of what's happening through these feedback loops, and these feedback loops circle round and become sort of stories and ways of making sense of what's going on. And I thought, you know, one key concept I think in organisational development, organisational change that ties into this is, if feedback loops are so important and they create stability and resilience, and you can think of it maybe a feedback loop as, you know, collaboration between teams, information sharing between teams, for example, then how do we create, or feedback that you have in a performance management process where you're trying to guide somebody's career or whatever? How do we create an environment within an organisation where we make those feedback loops really strong? And you know, psychological safety is one key concept that allows us to have that, to sort of create that. And then there's the idea, and this is the last of the sort of conditions, this idea of not being in equilibrium, and this dates back to that 1950 paper that I talked about open systems, and that open systems can stay out of equilibrium for quite a while, because we can gather energy. I can get energy from you by talking to you, or I can get energy by eating food. You know, I can get physical energy, I can get conceptual energy by stimulating my brain with great ideas. And we can bring in energy, we can bring in more people to work in the organisation, for example, or we can motivate them more. So complex systems have the ability to be able to create energy and stay out of, and use that to stay out of equilibrium, and to change and to adapt. So this is why I was saying the idea of Eleostasis, the ability to create stability through change by using energy, is maybe more relevant to organisational change than, say, something like homeostasis, which is trying to get you back to equilibrium. And you know, purpose helps with this as well. Clear sense of purpose helps to bind, and curiosity as well. This allows adaptive or complex systems to be curious and go out of their sort of comfort zones, their Markov blankets, and explore new territory. You know, to create new sources of food or whatever, or organisations to go and innovate. Okay, and then those conditions then allow for these certain outcomes. One of those outcomes is that we start to see spontaneity and self-order. So as you increase numerosity and systems start to feed back, they start to sort of clump together and they start to form order and start to look like they are being goal directed. They start to move in the same direction, you know, like that murmuration. They start to sort of cooperate to survive. And I thought there's some interesting ideas here around feedback loops and creating that sort of self-order by giving, you know, employee voice, and maybe it's synonymous with employee commitment, which is about the sort of emotional commitment that we have to organisations that sort of create an affinity between groups, and this idea of social exchange, you know, sort of back scratching, I'll do this if you do that, and so we form bonds around that, we form groupings around that as well, we form groupings around purpose. So just some ideas there. Yeah, and I think this idea of organisational justice and organisational fairness, that I think you can get the balance between autonomy and structure if you can be very clear and transparent about what your decision-making processes are. If everybody's clear on what the decision-making processes are, then small groups, individuals can start making decisions for themselves. But if the decision-making processes are not seen to be clear or transparent, people then just don't know how decisions are made, and it becomes very difficult to form these sort of self-governing groups. Okay, so that's, and then I just thought this idea of non-linearity is interesting as well. You know, like we all know the sort of the exponential curve, that as you increase numerosity and you increase diversity, you start to get so many more interactions within the system. So in fact, a group of 4 people creates 11 interactions, which is, you know, 11 potential separate interactions, you know, 6 two-way interactions, 4 three-way interactions, and 4 three-way interactions, yeah, and 1 four-way interaction. So if I can't remember what the numbers are, I haven't got them here. Oh, a group of 7, you'd have 120 interactions, for instance. So if you've got a you know, an organisation of 20,000, I think it's to the power of 10 or something. But yeah, lots of feedback loops, and potentially, you know, lots of stability, and potentially lots of causality caused by those feedback loops as well. And then I just thought, you know, I was just trying to visualize, you know, we're in an equilibrium, and we can use negative feedback loops to draw you back to equilibrium, or positive feedback loops to take you away from equilibrium. And we know that living systems are very good at, you know, they create positive feedback loops, you know, to maybe move out of their comfort zones and go and explore. And then you'll get maybe a negative reaction, you get a negative feedback loop, which draws you back to your stable environment. And you know, you can think about this in terms of feedback that we put into, you know, sometimes we want to be very clear about behaviours, and we want to create negative feedback loops about behaviours that don't fit with the organisational change that we want. And other times we want to just sort of be very positive and create positive feedback loops. We want people to just sort of go off in their own direction and kind of pursue the change on their sort of own terms, as it were. And this is a fine balance, because if you create too many positive loops, people get into too much of a sort of too many negative feedback loops. Potentially, you know, you get into groupthink and social loafing, all the rest of it in groups. And you know, one of the downsides, I guess, is negative feedback loops will, you know, reduce stress within the system. And then there's questions about how much stress is enough to create change. But anyway, I just thought this is an interesting dynamic, and sort of based on research in terms of the costs and benefits of trying to create more autonomous groups, and how you would make them not shoot off too much in one direction, but at the same time not stay where they are and not be innovative. So how you manage teams during change, this would be quite useful maybe. And then second to last one is robustness. So as I mentioned before, all these feedback loops create, and the sort of self-ordering process creates robustness. There's sort of redundancy in the system as well. So you can sort of push, if you imagine a jelly and you push the jelly, it will bounce back into its original shape, because there's sort of redundancy or sort of energy in the system that will push it back, as opposed to, I don't know, something that will sort of stay dented. And organizations will, and people bounce back because these feedback loops, and we can create energy, we can always sort of bounce back, which is the sort of idea of resilience in the system. And there's no central control, or that if there is no central control, then it means that one person isn't responsible and won't hold up everything that's going on. So the system can be more adaptive if there isn't one person in control, because the system will be sort of spontaneous. And yeah, the whole feedback loop system allows the system to be sort of adaptive as well. And this is sort of models of individual resilience and how that can be applied within organizational change. And and then the last one, well, sorry, second to last one, is that complex systems form these sort of modular groups. So the interactions become stronger and stronger and stronger, and so people form natural affinities and get work done between each other, and that creates hierarchies and subsystems. And this happens naturally within living systems as well. Systems become quite specialized. If you think about our body, and we've got different parts of our body that are very highly specialized in doing certain things, and there's a hierarchy. I guess everything is reliant on the brain working. And you can think about your liver as being an agile, self-sustaining, self-managing team, as it were, with its own specializations. But there's got to be some kind of high level of coordination, i.e. the brain that's managing all of this stuff. And so, yeah, this was just, I'll probably skip over this, but this was just, we had a debate on LinkedIn about how you create optimal dynamic teams that are both reliant on a direction of a hierarchy, but also have enough autonomy to kind of work themselves. And this comes back to this sort of dichotomy between autonomy and structure as well. So these are different compositions of effective teams, the cognitive state, the social state of the team, and the team composition. But you can have a look at that in more detail. And yep, this is the last one. This is how systems create. No, there's one more after this. Sorry, how systems create history and memory. So we the past behaviour can predict future behaviour. So again, this sort of causality thing, because of the feedback loops, because established relationships and the robustness of the system, and the system holds memory through its collective intelligence, and through the mental models as well that people build about their experiences of previous change. And if they've got bad previous change, then they're predicting future bad change. Knowledge sharing as well creates memory and history. So and we have lots of models for learning, creating learning environments within organizational change. There's action learning, communities of practice, creating cross-functional teams, doing post-mortems on projects. All that sort of stuff creates memory, doesn't it, or encodes memory. Yeah, it's just interesting here to see which types of interventions deliver on what kind of characteristics we want to create, I guess. So here, actually, sort of communities of practice are very kind of effective at transferring knowledge of socializing change, potentially learning from past experiences. But if we want to create a more experimental learning environment, maybe we should go for sort of action learning sets. So yeah, that's how we can create this this organizational memory and it's called, I guess, a learning organization. And then this is the last one. we come to adaptability, and now there's some sort of controversy, I guess, within complexity thinkers whether whether complex systems need to be adaptive to be called a complex system, and some people sort of agree and disagree on that. But I just thought really this just summarises where I think complex systems come into organisational change, in that for me there is a single definition of organisational change, and it's a practice of continually adapting human capability to meet organisations' internal and external ambitions. And this is certainly what Emery and Trist's work was sort of arguing in that causal texture of organisational environments paper we talked about earlier. And when you look at all the different definitions of organisational development, organisational change, change management, etc., they all seem to boil down to that. For me, they all seem to say the same thing. And in fact, this is Holland's definition of complex systems, systems that change and reorganise their component parts to adapt themselves to the problems posed by their surroundings. For me, there could be a better definition of organisational change than Holland is giving for complex systems there. And then we come on to this idea of emergence. I'll spend a little bit of time because I think this is important. And this idea of emergence has been around for a long time. So John Stuart Mill, thought that, observed that the whole is more than the individual parts. And then we've got Broad in 1925 suggesting that reality is structured at different aggregates, and we need to understand at what level we are working at, because reality will be different. Reality at a biological level is different from our reality, and the reality of an organisation might be different from the reality of an individual, and outside the organisation, perceptions of the organisations might be different. So we have to, and I think this is why it's useful to think about organisations being, individual, group and organisational level, because they all have their different realities and there are different behaviours that emerge at those different levels. Like collaboration, for instance, doesn't exist as an individual. It can only exist as an emergent behaviour that happens within groups. So there's a long history, and this diagram here is just to sort of say that those four conditions run throughout physics, chemistry, biology, neuroscience, and psychology, and the outcomes of those. Each of these levels in physics is a complex systems. Chemistry consists of complex systems, and biology does as well, etc. But they all have these outcomes of being self-organized and non-linear, etc. So yeah, you can read more about. It's worth reading separately about emergence. Is absolutely fascinating. One interesting argument around emergence is that emergence potentially only exists for as long as our understand or our lack of understanding of a system exists. So people didn't know how individual characteristics were passed from mother and father to offspring, for example. They sort of guessed that, oh, that's just an emergent property of creating a baby. But now we know that it's actually done through, DNA sequencing or whatever. So there is a challenge there, that what seems an emergent property now potentially is only emergent because we don't really have the understanding to be able to explain it properly. So we just say, oh, well, this is sort of emergent behavior that we can't really explain. So it's a fascinating area. I'll skip over this because this is just a sort of a loop between holism and reductionism, and I think the two have to exist together. If you're looking at complex systems, you have to reduce them to try and understand the whole, but you can't understand organizational change by understanding neuroscience. So there's no point in reducing individuals down to what's going on in their brain. That doesn't help you at an organizational change level. But it does help to understand, the neuroscience, I think, and how that drives behaviour and how potentially behaviour is aggregated up to an organisational level. So I think we just need to be very, very careful when we try and say, oh, you're a reductionist, which I've been accused of, or you're a holist and you're away with the fairies sort of thing. That in fact the two need each other and they're symbiotic. It's a circular argument, and that's what that was. And I love this quote down here, which sort of says reductionism is often vilified as being anti-complex system or an anti-complex system view of the world, reducing things down. But the idea of complex systems is a reduction. You know, we have to reduce. You know, the idea of physics or biology is a reduction. We have to look at these different tranches of reality, and so you know, our lives are reductions. We can't possibly understand the whole world when we look at a wall or we look at our computer. We're not looking at each individual pixel. We're looking at, you know, an aggregated view. So yeah, complex systems are ultimately a reduction that distinguishes the system from its environment, and then the Markov blanket that we mentioned. And yeah, I guess the key difference is that the non-reductionist approach considers the relationships between them. So what we're trying to understand is the relationship between different parts of a system, not trying to necessarily just reduce them. And that is a reductionist view, trying to understand the interrelationships. But anyway, this is my view, that complex systems actually pull reductionism and holism together. Interaction amongst the parts, which is a reductionism, make up the behavior of the whole. And I'll explain that a little bit later. We've only got a few slides left. So so here are just some of the benefits, I think, that I've talked about, that it does allow us to integrate lots of different theories. You know, we can go to physics, we can go to biology, and apply different thinking in those areas to organisational change. It does give us some causation, that viewing events as with multiple causes rather than single causes helps organisations to get to the root of problems. So we're trying to understand the causality better. It begs, for me, complex systems begs for experimentation, that you have to keep on, you know, touching the blob or the void to see how it reacts, and that over time systems do become more predictive potentially. So the earlier we can try and understand how the organisation's working and measure it on an ongoing basis and understand what our interventions are doing, that's the best form of evidence and the best way to, I think, run a change programme. And it's just more strategic. It just allows you to understand how everything within an organisation is connected, not just the change piece. So my second to last slide. Just some thoughts. I'm not actually sure I finished this, but as I was going through, I was just trying to summarise that. If we think about complex systems as having energy and entropy, you know, how are you managing and measuring that? That's really important for understanding complex systems. How do we link change to an ongoing narrative of success, which is building efficacy within the organisation? Getting the balance between structure and autonomy. Yeah, this idea of internal, external, balancing individual needs with organisational needs, with team needs, etc. Anyway, that's they're my sort of summary of thoughts. And then lastly, this is what I can hear myself reading. Sorry, what's happening here? As oh, sorry. This is my sorry, that was embarrassing. That's actually a video playing my recording, and I didn't realise. I do apologise for that. So that last, sorry, just let me change that. I didn't realise there was still a. Sorry. So this is just the process that I'm still playing. Okay, I don't know how to stop that, so I have to skip that last slide. Sorry, but that last slide was just showing a process that I'm using to understand interrelationships between different aspects of organisational change and constructs that create change within organisations. Okay, sorry, there's a bit rushed at the end, and because I wanted to leave time for you guys to talk. So there was a question. Can you go back over history and memory? Sure. So any other questions? History and memory here. So what this is Hema. What did you want to know more about?
I felt that in the recap, I probably didn't recall it, so I felt like maybe I missed it. So I don't know if you wanted to just talk a little bit more about this one.
Yeah, I think this is just that as the system grows and the feedback mechanisms become more robust, we start to see patterns, more robust patterns of behaviour, and the system kind of learns from itself, because people who observe those patterns start to build mental models of what's going to happen. So when I talk to Joe Bloggs, I've talked to him 100 times and he always reacts to me in the same way. So I start to build a mental model of who that person is. So it starts to build memory. And so the system becomes more predictable, because everybody's got a view of how things are, which again is a challenge, I guess, for organizational change, because ultimately you're trying to address or change those mental models of how things are in an organization. And that's all, yeah, that's about learning as well, isn't it? That's about collective intelligence. So collectively, how does the organization react when it's faced with the challenge, based on all those individual perceptions of those feedback loops, and how those feedback loops are going to work out. And I guess in organizations you see this so often, don't you? See teams just not talking to each other who need to talk to each other, and establishing those, like, neurons in a brain, connecting those and forming new learning pathways. Does that help at all?
Yeah, it does. I'm just trying to think around ProSci's change readiness assessments and how they talk about just the history of organizational change as one of the things that you try to tap into. And I'm also thinking about, with this post-pandemic reality and the fact that people are change fatigued, how does that contribute to that memory and that history? Would we be would we really need to consider the fact that people have been overloaded and they're going to remember that as we try to do changes going forward? And very specifically in my organization, we've got a lot of attrition. We've got we of course have trying to get people back into the office, but then at the same time, in my group specifically, we're doing a massive transformation, and a lot of people don't know what they don't know. And that history and memory, I'm seeing it impacting both the people who are currently there and then also the new hires who are coming in. And I get to play in that middle space of helping people along.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because people are probably overloaded from COVID and all the rest of it, and then you're going through a big transformation, and if they've got prior history with poor transformations, then I imagine there may even be some vicarious trauma. And I read somewhere someone was doing some research into sort of vicarious trauma of change and stress levels during change, initiatives or transformations. But yeah, yeah, definitely that must be that must be tough for you.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and you know, just being passionate about trying to help people through, but at the same time needing to coach leaders on, listen, there's only so far you can push.
Yeah.
Otherwise it's and some of the later slides, I think I think I have an opportunity to sort of take a look at that and see how I could coach my leaders specifically in terms of, listen, when you make a change like this, or when you go back to those old behaviors, these are the levers that you're going to be impacting as we're trying to get people through the change.
Yeah, and I think I don't know whether you do this, but I think, you know, it's worth monitoring if you know that there is potential trauma within the system from COVID or whatever, and you're going through transformation. Then why not measure well-being on an ongoing level, an ongoing, you know, monthly or at least quarterly? And there's the WHO 5, which is just 5 questions, which will give you a good idea of good index of people's well-being. There's also GAD, which is general anxiety scale as well, which I think has got 5 questions on it, and they're all very similar to engagement questions that I can send to you as well. The
Oh,
Utrecht
that would be
scale.
lovely, because I have a very simple pulse checking model that I use. I've not heard of Who 5, and we just did our employee opinion survey, so we have that data coming in about how people are feeling as
Yeah,
well.
and I think even just the gesture of saying
Mhm.
that you're going to monitor it and that you're interested in employee welfare and well-being will probably lift energy levels anyway, won't it?
Okay.
Particularly if you've got some sort of interventions that will help people.
Can you provide a link or suggestion when you post this this presentation about the 5 somewhere?
Yeah, if you just type, well, just type Who 5, Who 5.
5.
Okay.
5 well-being index. There it is.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just pop that in. But that's a robust scale that's been used. What's Who? But it's interesting because, you know, depression. You know, what I read about depression. You know, is that's caused by looking backwards and people, you know, feeling that they can't change the past, or, you know, they've got regrets about the past. And then you've got anxiety, which is having problems with trying to predict the future, that, you know, the future is so uncertain that you become anxious. And they're actually potentially 2 different things, but you can see how they could quite easily occur within change management, because change management, you're upsetting the future, aren't you? You're creating anxiety, and people are potentially getting depressed because they're thinking, well, I've been through all this before, and now you're
Yes.
going to drag me through it again.
And then the other aspect around it is that with so many people leaving, the people who remain, the volume of just the day-to-day workload on top of trying to change, it's it it to me it's just a matter of breaking points right now, and really severe burnout.
Yeah. Well, I think the best that you can do is just alert people to that, isn't it? And I'm just looking up the general anxiety disorder scale for you. GAD-7, it's called.
Okay.
Well, but I you know, I if you use the you can get the Utrecht scale, which is employee engagement, and there are just 3 questions in there, and they're very similar to the Who 5, which is why well-being and engagement are very, it's about energy levels, isn't it? Are very close, closely related concepts. Brilliant. Okay. Thank you, Natalie. Alex, your discussion about paradox with regards to uniqueness and belonging. I like that. Liquid work, liquid modernity. I have to look that up. I've never heard of that. Thank you. Did you want to build on that, Natalie? Maybe she's left. She's got a red ring around her. Any other points? I mean, I do realise we started the call with sort of 20 people, and it's gone down. I don't know if that's because I'm just going through too much. Is it too much, or?
Oh, definitely not. I joined late, and this is just exactly what I needed to stimulate my thinking. So thank you very much for this.
Brilliant. Thanks, Hema. Thanks.